Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the brand spanking new episode of A Cultural History of Canada. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Mackenzie. How are you?
I'm great. Absolutely fantastic. How are you?
Doing all right. As we were talking about before, going through some James Bond movies, and they're terrible.
Ugh,
I feel like that's most of our off-air conversations now is like, hey, saw this piece of media
isn't
or
it
read this
garbage?
piece of media. It sucks. Whoever said the death of media criticism was here was wrong. It's all terrible.
It will always be here.
Well, today we're going to be talking about
Oh,
a different type. Oh, did I cut out for there for a second?
that's fine. Keep going.
All right, great. Today we're going to be talking about a different kind of pretend and co-option, much like Sean Connery did with the Japanese and You Only Live Twice. Um, we're going we're going to be talking about a guy who, for most of his life, went by the name of Grey Owl, but was actually not anywhere near being called Grey Owl originally.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, we'll just kind of talk about this guy a little bit. Why? Because I wanted to. He really has very little bearing on like the grand scheme of Canadian history. Like most people would have no idea who we're talking about when we're talking about this guy. He's just a
hmm
weird thing that happened for some time in the 1920s and 30s in Canada, and some people wrote about it, both contemporary to Grey Owl's life and afterwards. Right, Indigenous people wrote about him,
hmm
and that's kind of the main cultural item that we're going to be talking about today is um, a book of poetry by Armand Garnet Ruffo, who's an Ojibwe poet who kind of interpreted Grey Owl's life through poetry. Um, yeah, I don't know if this episode's going to be anything. Like you said, we're just going to be talking about a guy, right?
We're just gonna be talking about
But yeah,
some guy.
just some dude. Um, in red face, I guess. But he, I don't know. I think you can also make a claim that by doing what he did, he does channel a lot of the anxieties that were emerging in the Western world at the time,
hmm
um, in both some problematic and interesting ways, right? Um, which I think is one of the good things that the poetry does is kind of not come down too critically on a British guy who basically pretended to be indigenous. Right.
Right.
Anyway, we can get into it. Before we do that, obviously, big thank you and big shout out to all our Patreon supporters. We, really appreciate your support. If you want to join in on the fun that's happening over there, which includes early episodes, which includes extra episodes, which we'll be recording soon, then you can do so for $1 or $3 a month, and kind of helps boost the show in a small
Woohoo!
but significant way. Um, and yeah,
Boost it,
we should
baby.
be recording. I'm sorry.
Boost it, baby.
Hell yeah. Should yeah. I was gonna try to create a song out of Boost It Baby, but no, I don't
Boost
have
it
the mental
real
fortitude
good.
to do that. Okay. Have you ever heard of Gray Owl?
Nope.
Or great. I would have been floored if you had.
If I
just
just knew everything.
just of all the things that you know or don't know about Canadian literature, if you had known a single thing about this guy, I would have just cried. um, but what's kind of interesting, right? As we already mentioned, he is this complicated figure, right? A British man who basically pretended to be indigenous for most of his life. Um, is that he wasn't the first to do that, right? There is like a long history of Western civilization and colonizers, especially, right? Co-opting indigenous ideas. We still see it today, right?
Mhm.
Um, the most egregious examples is, things like imagery and symbols that are being used, right, by sports teams that causes a lot of controversy at times. But for a long time, this idea that indigenous people were just like these pure beings of nature, right, is something that was often co-opted and was often created and constructed as an image, either to give validity to ecological ideas or just as a way of framing indigenous people as these primitive beings, right, who were somehow closer to nature because of it, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I don't think it's always obviously it can be very pernicious, right, and very detrimental to indigenous cultures, obviously. Um, I don't think, however, it was always done with ill intent. Um, I think it was mostly, or at least at first, and in a lot of cases, done out of a lack of knowledge, right, about a lot of things,
Well,
or
it's
misinformation.
they're in the right spirit a lot of the time.
I guess. Yeah, I don't want to give too much credit to people who do this.
No,
Like that's why I'm choosing my
no,
words
not at
carefully.
all. I mean, I don't mean spirit. I mean, just like I don't know. They're just
Yeah, ill-informed.
it's yeah. They're just dumb.
Yeah. But the what's interesting is that you also see a kind of flip side to this, and even as early as like the 17th and 18th century, what you see with a lot of early settlers, um, who arrive in Canada, in the United States, you do see actually a lot of settlers wanting to join indigenous nations and indigenous groups who ostensibly they were there to assimilate and colonize, right? But as far back as hundreds of years ago, in the early days of settler colonialism, you do have already people who are like, no, this colonial project is kind of bullshit, and
Mm,
these people these people have a better idea of society than what I initially imagined, right? And so this is kind of, I guess, a more positive form of adopting another person's culture. Obviously, it didn't always go, swimmingly, um, but you did see like some kind of cultural exchanges in that vein that did happen. So there is kind of a long history of this type of, I guess, culture crossing, if you can call it that, at least in Canada. And
mm.
yeah, I just wanted to kind of like foreground this. We're going to be talking about one version of it in the 1920s and 30s, but this has gone on for a long time, right? And you can probably see it in Australia as well, where you're currently located. I'm sure they have a history of that as well.
Oh God,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah. I remember actually when I was in Australia, or at least if it did happen, I don't remember seeing it or I didn't pay attention to it when I was there. Like, do you notice that often? Like the co-option of indigenous or aboriginal imagery or people's ideas?
I mean, yeah, yeah, just in general. It's just one of those things that like you also have to wonder like how it's one of those things where at what point do you just stop like with the sports teams type of situation, you know?
Yeah.
Co-opted
Yeah.
imagery, but also like at what point do you because now I know there have been like I know that I remember there was a guy who wrote a book. He was a very like long time First Nations colony leader. And he's like, you know what? With the whole sports team thing, that's just free publicity for us. So
Yeah. Just kind of there. You got to roll with the punches on some of it. Yeah.
yeah, well, just yeah. So like I know, for example, like at the school that I'm currently at, and like many schools in Canada and the US or whatever,
Mhm.
we use a war cry.
Oh, okay.
Like it's a
Yeah.
very common thing to do to, and like it obviously is taking and using First Nations.
Yeah. 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 No, that's straight up. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
war cries have been a thing in many cultures, but yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
No, but like the specifics of the like listening to the war cry, it's very much
Oh, okay.
inspired.
Okay. Okay.
In the
Yeah.
same way, you
Yeah.
know, the Haka dance that New
Mm.
Zealand is famous for. So, but it also again, it's one of those things like yeah, it's co-opted, but it's also pretty much accepted and it's known as like a real thing now. So it's sort of,
Yeah.
eh.
There's like there's that fine line between like just harmless type or not necessarily harmless. It can be harmful, of course. But yeah, like you say, more accepted forms of
Yeah.
cross-cultural or co-option, and it's like some that are straight up used for
Well,
harmful
at what point does
purposes.
it become co-option? At what point does it become like intentionally harmful? At what point?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a very big discussion. But with this guy,
Yeah.
with this person we're talking about today, fully just co-opted.
Fully just co-opted. Um, but again, not for the purposes of like ill intent. I
No.
genuinely don't think it was with
No,
purposes of ill intent.
this man is giving like big vibes of Heart of Darkness. What was the name of the
Oh, Kurtz.
Dr. Livingston?
Oh,
No.
not Dr. Livingston. Joseph Conrad. Mhm.
Yeah. But no, that's the author, but I mean like the character
Yeah.
in the book.
Oh, oh crap. Yeah, the
But
main
yeah,
character.
yeah, like this idea of like I'm just like them for real. They are my spirit children, spirit
Hmm.
people. And it's like,
Yeah, yeah. And at the same time, Conrad, despite doing that, was very much criticizing what was happening
oh,
in
for
the
sure.
Belgian Congo. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Well, it's
Yeah.
just it. And again, like, yeah, it's, I've seen, because I've seen people say even the idea of like, because those quizzes, like, what's your spirit animal?
Yeah. Hmm.
That's co-option as well.
Oh yeah, big time.
And
Yeah.
it's so you, there's just so much of it. I think it's hard for us to be like point out to specific examples because we've just done so much of it within our daily
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah. I think that's actually a good example of like what can be harmful because it kind
Mhm.
of denudes because it
It
is a
diminishes
genuine.
like the actual
Yeah.
importance of spiritual.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is like something that people do take seriously within those cultures and within those communities.
Hmm.
And so to kind of diminish it to a BuzzFeed article is like, what are you doing? Do you really think that's the best
Yeah.
use of this idea?
Is your
Yes,
online quiz.
apparently. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, in 1888, this British guy called Archibald Bellany, right, was born, and he was raised until his teens by his two aunts in Hastings. And during this time, right, and this is like purely a product of empire,
Mm,
he very much fantasized about North American indigenous people, right? Or obviously Indians, as he would have called them. And this would have been purely a product of like the boys' novels that would have been sold across the empire, right? Which very much wanted to give you a pie in the sky and romanticized version of settler life, right? Which we've talked about on the show before, right? You had authors like R.M. Ballantyne, you had Jack London, who did a bunch of those novels, right?
mm,
Novels of the frontier, and it gave this very heroic view of the final frontier, right? That was North America. And Bellany
mm.
fell for it hook, line, and sinker, except he didn't want to be a cowboy. He wanted to be an Indian. And basically, that's what he ended up doing, right? At 17, he emigrated to Canada. So this would have been in 1906. And pretty much for the next 20 years of his life, he would live in Northern Ontario. He had a brief stint of years of service during the First World War, but aside from that, he pretty much lived in Canada for the rest of his life. Um, and he would, start off his early days in Canada as a guide and packer, right? Pretty,
Hmm.
normal frontier stuff. Because yes, Northern Ontario in 1906 was still pretty much the frontier.
Hmm.
And well, in 2024, it's still pretty much the frontier. Have you ever been to Northern Ontario? It's terrible.
I think a little bit,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
also like I've been to the Yukon frontier.
Exactly. It's apples and oranges at this point.
It's all fucking relative.
I mean, anything outside of Montreal and Toronto is the frontier in my book. So
Vancouver is the frontier.
Halifax,
Ottawa.
the frontier.
Ottawa is the frontier. You're gonna spot a wild Trudeau out in the wild.
Laval, the frontier.
Okay, but Laval is. Oh God.
Oh God, oddly
Back to
specific.
Bellany. Back to Archibald.
He would actually, once he was in Northern Ontario, he would meet up with Ojibwe bands that were in the area. And that's kind of where his slow process of not only ingratiating himself with these local inhabitants, but also quote unquote becoming them pretty much started.
Mm.
They taught him their language, and he would start to, know about their ways of living, about hunting, about their ceremonies, and so on. And in 1910, he would actually marry an Ojibwe woman. Um, so he would have been 20, he would have been 21 at the time.
Hmm.
But, you know, he didn't really have any, proper sense of stability in his life or what was to be expected of him within the confines of a marriage. And he would actually leave her, very quickly. He abandoned her and their infant daughter after only a year of being married with uh, this woman. So, not great,
Hmm.
not a great start to his life, but, you know, again, as someone who arrived on the frontier and was pretty much up to his own devices at the age of 17, you don't have a lot of role models.
Hmm.
So maybe a soft pass, but yeah, not great.
No.
Um, so it's actually about 2 years later that he would start to be, he would start to claim that he was actually indigenous. Um, and so you start to see this discourse in his letters and his personal writing, which are actually quite extensive. He wrote a lot, right, in journals and books and so on.
What
And
was his
that's,
like? How did he back up his claim?
look, it was the early 20th century. People just made shit up, dude.
No, but like, no, that's what I want to know. Like, was he says his mom, his dad, like great, 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 great grandpappy, spiritually he was chosen as the Messiah? Like, what was?
Oh, so I think he just said he was born among them. I think he just like fully went into it. It wasn't like, oh, I have a grandparent on one side
Mhm.
that's that. He's just like, I was born among the Ojibwe and I'm constructing my life. I lived here and I'm just part of it. But we have to remember he could be vague in some ways because a lot of people didn't pay attention to that,
Right.
right? Right. So the early days, again, he was like very tentative from what I understood. Right. He just claimed vaguely that he was indigenous or Indian. Right. Um, and he kind of, as he would learn more and more about Ojibwe ways specifically, right? That's when he felt more and more comfortable actually claiming to be indigenous because I think on some level he genuinely did feel like he was a part of the civilization that he was learning so much about, right?
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so he, like I said, he was sent briefly to the front, and it's when he came back that you see this shift fully into Gray Owl, right? He no longer called himself Archibald Bellany. That person was dead. And what's kind of interesting, and this relates to a previous episode, is that a lot of what he was basing his claim on, to answer your question, is a disgust with what he called civilization, right? And I
Hmm.
find it interesting that it's the experience with World War One that triggered that. um, it's like where you see modernity full front, right? Like just the wrath of industrial civilization on the
Gas is
battlefield. He's like,
burning your skin,
nope,
bullets are riddling your body, you're getting crushed under tanks.
yeah. He's like, this is civilization. Bite me.
Peace,
Go ahead. Sorry.
peace. That's what I'm saying. Peace out.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Um, there's this is where I kind of want to stop and read the first Ruffo poem,
Mm.
which is on page 27 if you want to follow along. By the way, I linked to the book on archive.org, so if people want to read or listen or read the whole thing or just the poems that I'm
Mm.
referring to, it's there. And this kind of does demonstrate what I'm talking about. And by the way, Ruffo used Bellamy's texts and writing to make his poems about him. So like he straight up sometimes verbatim uses Bellamy's texts and basically creates found poems, or what we call found poems, and reconstructs them as poetic material. And so this one's called Archibald Bellamy, 1915 to 1916. Where I'll just read the first 3 stanzas. You want to talk civilization. Okay, let's talk war. On August 6th, I joined the 13th Battalion, and because I can handle a rifle, I'm sent promptly to the trenches. One black night, I hand my greatcoat on a branch sticking up in the mud. In the morning, a dead man's green arm hands it back to me. I see a man trying to stuff his intestines back inside himself. He asks for help. And this experience, right, just ruins him, as it would. Right?
Yeah, it would. It's genuinely just one of the most vile acts of war we've ever seen because there was no rules.
Oh, exactly. So
Like the
what do you
Geneva
do?
Convention was not a thing.
And it is kind of interesting because he's not unique in this situation, of course, not just in the
No.
like fear of civilization, or at least disdain for civilization that would come after, but also in like the reinscribing of your identity after, where so many
Hmm.
people were dying. There's just like, oh, I can start new and fresh. I could just
Mm.
reset my life. How about I do that? But like, instead of going back to England or whatever, how about I just go to Australia, or how about I just live the rest of my life in Cambodia or some shit? Like, I can just start again. I can literally die,
Hmm.
right? For all intents and purposes, and be reborn as someone new, right? Um, and I think that's kind of interesting to think about, right? That you can kind of think of the transition from Bellany to Grey Owl as a kind of rebirth for him.
Mm.
Um, and again, I do think he gets a pass somewhat because he took it so seriously and because he was willing to learn, but it doesn't make it any less problematic. I don't know. I don't know if you have
Yeah.
any thoughts about anything I've said so far, but let's like
I don't know.
ideas.
Like fair. It's I it's not, yes, his experience was unique, but I think there's no average way to respond to trauma like that.
No.
And so I think I'm not surprised that his way got colored in that he had these other stories and preconceived notions in his head already, and that he would react to it like that.
Yeah. It's
But he also just had a bunch of stories.
yeah, exactly. From growing up, right?
Hmm.
The Indian stories. Yeah, for sure. Um, and so what's kind of cool is that when he came back, um, he would actually marry, right?
Hmm.
In this case, an Iroquois wife called Anahareo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She's long dead now. She's not going to come after me, but I still hope I'm pronouncing that right. Um, and basically, she never knew that he was British. Like, this is where the
Okay.
lie fully solidifies itself, right? Like he's so embedded by this point into Ojibwe culture and ways of life and traditions that he can just actually fool people that are also indigenous into believing that he was never British in the first place, right?
Hmm.
And it would have made sense also in the context of the war because there were indigenous battalions, right? So he could have easily made that claim as well, right? Indigenous people were sent to the front as well as Anglo, French, Canadians, whatever, right? So
Hmm.
it can all technically fit within a puzzle, right? Um, so it is kind of fascinating that even his wife was just none the wiser about this
Mhm.
ever. And she would actually be the one to push him towards conservation work. Um, Basically, what happened is that after the war, he continued his trapping trade for a bit. He was a guide. He, participated in the fur trade that was still technically ongoing, even if it was on its dwindling days, right, in the early 20th century. Um, and um, Basically, she made him realize that like what he was doing was extremely violent, and she made him realize that there's more to the world and life around him than just hunting these creatures, right, for profit. And she persuaded him by bringing into their cabin two baby beavers,
Mm.
and basically raising them as children. And that's an adorable story in my mind. Just like
Mm.
coming home from work one day and having two baby beavers in your home. And that convinced him, right? Um, anyway, kind of cool. That story actually, where the affectionate and childlike behavior of young beavers um, would actually would actually convince Gray Owl to never take the life of another beaver and another animal again, and would be the basis for one of the books that he wrote for children.
Mhm.
Right. So he kind of inspired himself on his own life in some of the fiction that he wrote. So that's kind of cool. Right. Um, by the way, to answer your question about like what his backstory was, like
Mhm.
how he convinced people, I had it in my notes. I just didn't have it here in front of me. His official story was that he was the son of an Apache woman and a Scot. Right. Sorry about that. So just so you know, that was
That's his
that was
story.
the backstory. Um, okay. Um, I want to turn to another poem here. Or do you want to read this one?
And he, uh, which one is this? 71,
Page 55.
page 50. And this is talking about his relationship with his wife that he tricked.
55 is the one. Well, yeah, he talks a little bit about the beavers, which is why I want to
Okay,
talk about it because beavers are
sure.
fucking cool.
We fucking love beavers. What you see are the sorry remnants of those who blundered their job, set their traps so the beaver can twist out, leaving behind shattered bone and sinew, condemned to survive with limbs cut and wrenched off. What is worse than seeing these industrious little people try to prepare for winter? Build house and dam, collect food with stumps instead of hands and feet. What you mustn't neglect to mention are those who dynamite the house or violate with poison, leaving senseless destruction. What is it all for? A livelihood? A quick buck? What kind of men are these? It makes you wonder. 10 out of 10.
Thank you. Um,
He just wrote a poem about beavers. Uh,
in this case, it's Ruffo, like channeling Bellamy's voice,
yeah.
but yeah, poem about
And
beavers.
I get the intent of it for
Mhm.
sure, but it's like it's environmental discourse for people who are just getting to it, you know?
Yep.
It's
I
very
think you hit the
basic.
nail on the head on that one.
Yeah, it's like again, it's this is the thing with most, and I say this as a white man, so I could speak with like most white men getting into topics of like discussions of race segregation, feminism, like we're always good, like we're way behind on that anyway. So this is like, yeah, no duh. No fucking shit. We're like
And yet, okay, this is what's
it's the
really
equivalent of the
cool.
fucking monologue from the Barbie movie.
Welcome to the 70s, Greta Gerwig. But that's what's kind of cool is that for all the like simplicity of it, of like, oh, save the beavers. And like saying this in 1920 whatever, like
Mm.
people lost their minds. It was like, oh my God, yeah, that's awesome. Like I cannot stress how popular Bellany became um with this type of discourse, right?
Well, yeah, because
Um
it was just an excuse for more white men to act like him and steal shit under the guise of
yeah,
like reconnecting with nature.
I think part of it was that, absolutely. And I think part of it was also like, oh, let's go see this indigenous person who we're fetishizing, or at least what we see
Yeah.
as this indigenous person who we're fetishizing as like this nature loving person, right? And again, that's not to say that what he's saying is entirely wrong. Save the beaver, right?
Mhm.
Beavers are cool. They should be saved and save nature.
Beavers are
The
10 out of
way
10, don't get me wrong.
the way it's being presented and the way it's going about it is very
Well,
much
it's like it's being
emblematic of a
presented like,
particular.
yeah, I discovered the beavers.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody ever thought about saving the beavers till I came along.
Yeah. And my wife told me about it, but let's not talk about
Yeah. Yeah, but she's a woman.
her.
And she's easily tricked anyway. She thinks I'm a...
All jokes
Yeah.
aside, apparently they had quite the like loving relationship. Um,
Who
from
told
what
us
I
that?
saw,
Him or her? It's easy to have a loving relationship when everything's a lie.
even after his death, apparently, like it, she apparently was
Well,
like,
yeah,
yes,
no, she
that was a
still
lie.
believes his lie. It's gonna like
Again,
I'm sorry, there's no world where I'm gonna look at that relationship and be like, yes, this is positive and wholesome.
yeah, because it's based on a fundamental untruth. Yeah, yeah,
It's based on him fundamentally abusing like her lack of certain knowledge or whatever, you know?
mm, yeah, yeah. But within the confines of that relationship, apparently it was quite like
I guess.
nice. Yeah. Um, but basically, like from that experience of the poem that you read, he and his wife went to northern Quebec and set up a sanctuary for beavers, which is pretty cool. And basically
Beaver
founded a colony for
conservation
the
officer. I love it.
hell yeah.
We're
And
all about
exactly that's
environmental
where
conservation on this podcast.
that's kind of where the relatively new Parks Canada discovered him. By then, Parks Canada had been around for about 15 years. I think when was Parks Canada created? Do you remember 1911, 1910,
Oh,
something like
something
that?
like that. I think it's one of those, again, the organization evolved and changed and
Yeah, yeah. But like a form of Parks Canada already
yeah.
existed by then for at least like a decade or so.
So it was established in
Um,
1911 as the Dominion Parks branch under the Department of Interior, becoming the world's first national park service.
Great. So they basically see his work in northern Quebec and are like, this guy, this guy knows about beaver, right? Um,
Mhm.
so let's hire him as our beaver expert. And there's a million jokes that you can make about that. But it's good for him, I guess. Like, and it is kind of interesting that how you see the evolution of this institution that we have today in
Mhm.
Canada, like of Parks Canada being like, okay, we have to include specific people who will be taking care of specific animals, right? And actually
Mhm.
taking the time to preserve what we do have. Um, but again, outside of just the Parks Canada thing, I cannot overestimate just how huge Bellany became as basically an eco warrior, right? In like 1920. Um, and I wanted to point to like the poem on page 71 that does point to this, where he says, the current is faster than I expect. Suddenly, my articles break into demand. Letters of congratulations come flying in from across Britain and the United States, few from Canada, which I find disconcerting. Strangers want to visit me. Reporters want to interview me. They announce that I'm the first to promote conservation, the beaver, the forests, the Indian way of life. I begin by signing my name Gray Owl and saying I was adopted by the Ojibwe and that for 15 years I spoke nothing but Indian. Then, before I know it, I have Apache blood. Finally, I'm calling myself an Indian writer.
Oh
Fast. It all
no.
happens so fast.
Oh no. Oh no. I love how
That's
you
what's kind
know
of
this
fast.
work. Like you know this
Mm,
works because of the
yeah.
fact that nobody like it's such a sign of its time that nobody brought him up on the using the word Indian.
But of course, but at the time, no one, and even indigenous people did refer to themselves as that, by the way, even at the
Yeah,
time.
no, even like, God,
Yeah.
I spoke nothing but Indian.
Yep.
Oh no, people,
But
that's not.
that's kind of what's fascinating is like, again, he used it for ostensibly good purposes, right? Conservation, right? Wanting to
Listen,
actually
I'm fine
promote
with using a
healthy
bad thing in a
relationships.
good way, but like, let's just make a good
Yeah.
thing and use it in a good way, you know?
No, because I have to be a white dude co-opting it.
Yeah. Well, that's and yeah, it's good for
Yeah.
conservation, but also
Yeah.
what kind of damage did he end up doing as well in reverse to indigenous culture by pretending all these things?
Yeah. Yeah. That's there's been
Like,
there's been a lot of books who consider that in much more detail than we'll be able to on like one
yeah.
podcast. But I would actually point to an excellent book by a historian called Donald Smith, who wrote a book on Gray Owl and how his this creation myth of Gray Owl happened. It was published in like 1990 or something, so it's a bit
Mhm.
older. Came out like 35 years ago at this point, but it's a really good book, very well written if people want to like more go into more depth of what exactly you're talking about. Um, because he never lived through the damage. That's the thing, is that he was
Yeah.
relatively young when he died. He died in like the late 1930s, which wouldn't have been that old. Um, and so that's, yeah, that would have made him 50. Um, so he never saw the damage that he could have potentially caused. So for him, it was entirely beneficial, both for him having a successful career and for the message that he was actually promoting of conservation
Mhm.
and, you know, quote unquote Indian way of life. Um, yeah, but I do agree. You have to kind of take the fact that this is very harmful, or it can be
This
very
is
harmful.
well, think of it this way. How many actual indigenous conservationists did he like prevent, you know?
Yeah,
Because that's the
yeah.
thing. He sets all this up, and yeah, he's got his wife with him. I'm sure that's great. But then, how connected is he to the actual culture and the tribes of the area and getting them to help out?
Again, from what we can tell, as much from like his own writing, right, and the historiography that we have access to, somewhat, right? He did actually try to learn genuinely. He did seem to have like a genuine vested interest. He wasn't doing it for just selfish purposes, but
But he
probably,
still
like you're
says,
saying,
"Oh, I am the first conservationist."
other people say that of him.
Of course, no, the other people say that.
Yes,
He
he's
would
too humble.
never bite me.
Yeah, I do find it interesting. I do like that from the poem, though. Letters of congratulations come flying in from Britain and the United States, but not from Canada, or few from Canada, which I
Which
find,
makes me concerning.
yeah, yeah, which I find disconcerting. Yeah. Um, I don't know. I find that kind of like a nice touch on the part of Ruffo's
Yeah.
poetry, right? That
Yeah, no,
the
for sure. I
further
like
away
that
you
line.
go, yeah, the further away you go from like where he's actually active, the more they can create images in
Well,
their
you know, it's
mind
this
of
idea of
who he
like
is.
from a distance he looks indigenous, but when you actually get close enough to see, you're like, oh, he's just some white man.
He looks he looks just like me, but tanned. Hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Um, all right. So, like I said, he would kind of become extremely popular. He wrote a lot of articles. He went on lecture tours, right?
Of
Mostly
course.
across Canada and the US. Although he did actually do international speak tours in Britain, right? So he was international sensation Gray Owl, right?
Mhm.
Um, and he would eventually be, I guess, promoted from beaver conservation officer to the naturalist of Parks Canada service. Um, and
Okay.
it's from that position that he would go on to publish basically a series of novels and tales that were framed as like an indigenous voice about these things. Sometimes just framed as Indigenous stories themselves, which is again where it gets a little bit dicey.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, extremely popular, both with young readers who wanted to, learn more about the Canadian environment, as well as adults who just thought that they were fun stories. So in 1931, he published The Men of the Last Frontier, and in 34, Pilgrims of the Wild. In 35, The Adventures of Sajo and Her Beaver People, which is, of course, inspired by his own experience with beavers.
God damn it.
And in 1936, only 2 years before he died, Tales of an Empty Cabin. And all of these, right, were about animals and life in the Canadian wilderness and et cetera, et cetera. Which, to make like an interesting parallel here, um, around the same time, a very famous Canadian poet called Robert, oh God, I want to say Charles Seaton was his name.
Mm-hmm.
Um, was it Charles Seaton or Robert Seaton? There was another poet right around this time that was doing very similar things, uh, but he wasn't claiming to be Indigenous. He just stole from them. he just he actually there's actually like images of him dressing up in Indigenous garb, even though he like never claimed to be Indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea of bringing in Indigenous knowledge to talk about animals and life in the Canadian wilderness was gaining traction beyond Grey Owl and beyond the books that he was saying, like where people were not even pretending to be Indigenous anymore. They were just openly,
Yeah.
claiming that these ideas came from Indigenous groups, um, and that was enough to just talk about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's your negative impact for you, right? Because they didn't even hide the stealing.
Thank God.
At least Bellany had the decency to like go full throttle on it, I guess. but, uh, um, and yeah, he was basically by the mid 1930s considered to be Canada's most famous quote unquote Indian. Um, and he would actually be featured in films that were produced in North America and in Britain. He was often portrayed as a beaver protector in more ecologically conscious or wilderness conscious films. So just kept
Mm-hmm.
going with the beaver protection there. Which good on you. You might as well just mind that thing as long as you can. Um, and outside of the jokes that we're making, he was actually quite eloquent in the speeches that he was making, and people very
Mm-hmm.
much like thought he was a good speaker and genuinely took him seriously. He wasn't just someone who was a minstrel type figure,
Mm-hmm.
right? That people liked to laugh at and kind of jokingly like, oh, look at the Indian talking about nature again, haha. Like, people genuinely took his words as
Yeah.
fascinating,
Yeah.
which cool, right? Good on him.
Good for them.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add about anything I'm saying so far, but yeah.
Ooh. I listen, on the one hand, I love me some conservation efforts. Don't
Hmm.
get me
Hmm.
wrong. But it just feels kind of icky the more we look at like how this happened.
Hmm.
Like it just I feel like it just would have been much more tolerable if he was just like, "Oh, I've seen and I've decided I want to be like them," instead of "I am one of them."
Yeah.
Like there's a very small difference that could have been made that I think would have done a lot, like made this all just much more palpable, even for its own time. Like looking back at the way we consider people within context, I'm like, this is still really like what kind of like delusion or madness was he under? Like what were his intentions with this? What was his like did he believe his own lie?
He absolutely did. I there's no doubt in my mind that he genuinely believed that, right?
Hmm.
Um, whether I think he was like he wasn't so deluded as to imagine that he wasn't born in England. I think like obviously yes, but I
Hmm.
think he fully believed that what he lived through and like the experiences that he had with various indigenous groups and learning from them made it enough was enough for him, right? I fully believe that, right? Yeah, and just as an example of like when we say eloquent speaking, right? I just have an example here from 1936, which I think is good, where he writes, "Modern influences have taken away much of the romance, picturesque appearance from Indian camps. Their racial pride has been sapped, and destitute and hopeless, they no longer have the ambition to keep up the old methods and traditions, so that home life is slipshod and wretched, and national character is falling into decay." Um, Again, some of the language is a bit wonky,
Yeah.
but in terms of like speech and ability to convey a message in an effective way, I can see why people grabbed onto it. Right? It creates striking images, I would say.
No, for sure. Like I get why it all happened. Like the poetry, his imagery seems like he was very good. Like this poetry is very good at painting an image in our heads. Like I understand why this captured everybody's imagination. It just feels very like what the fuck, you know? Almost culty.
Yeah. Yeah. He would actually go on to
Start
be
a cult.
no, but he did gain like a cult following in a sense because he would like meet extremely famous people for his work,
Yeah.
including members of the royal family. Um, and
Boy. Oh no.
this
Papa,
this
we are
one is
dining
from,
with the Aborigines tonight.
oh no,
And
it
then they
wasn't
see
them
him.
that made something weird. This is from Lovett Dixon's 1970s
No.
work on Bellany. This is how Grey Owl um, is
Oh,
talking
Gray
or is
Owl.
talked about in relation to the royal family, right? So he lectured in front of them. And so he walks on stage, and this is quoting from Dixon, where he writes, "Grey Owl, quote, flung up his right arm in salute, and addressing the king directly said, 'How kola?' There followed a few words in the Ojibwe tongue, then his arm lowered, which being interpreted means, 'I come in peace, brother.'" So just playing up the stereotype.
For
That
fuck's
first
sake.
line, lifting up
For
the arm and saying,
fuck's
"How kola," I
sake.
was like, this is something out of Peter Pan.
Right from the get-go, we're just like falling over. Oh my god.
10 out of 10.
Oh,
But again,
10 out of
they're the
10
royals.
space opera.
They're the royals. They've never seen an indigenous person in their life. They don't
No,
know
they
any
don't know what the
different.
fuck is going on.
No, they're just here to see someone talk about nature for a bit,
Beavers.
about beavers.
Some
We
angry
want to see a
beavers.
man who's protecting the things that we made so much money off of.
I want a man to examine my beaver. No, Mama, no.
Hey, how improper of you. How dare you? Shush now.
I want the alternate
Um,
timeline where he becomes the Canadian Rasputin.
yes,
That's the alt history I'm here
terrible,
for.
terrible.
But like,
Yeah, like I really want that.
oh my God. I don't know.
Yeah, again, and we'll get to
Again,
it, but like he does he does seem troubled by his success in many ways. Like one of the
mhm.
poems that I read does show the unexpected success. Like he was like, "Oh shit, I genuinely wasn't expecting to be this popular with my articles." Right? But even later in Ruffo's book of poems, there's one on 144 that he does show frustration when he says, "Can't go on with this frustrated, dried out, saintly, unfulfilled, static, vegetating life. My mind is
Mhm.
empty, my soul shriveling in a hard, avaricious, narrow minded, in parentheses, European, farmer's West. Jealousy and meanness. Beaver Lodge is truly a refuge, but is at times a cell. All night work, never a day, eyes failing. No inspiration. Speed was my God, 50 miles a day, 2,300 miles. One summer, constant rapid travel. Now nothing for the mind." And like,
Mhm.
so again, not to say that he was a redeemable figure necessarily, but it it does seem to weigh heavy on him in many ways. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Again, I don't think that forgives what he did necessarily, but interesting to know that he did feel disturbed. Right. Um, yeah. He also met then Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King in 1936.
Of
So,
course.
a bit of a step down from the royals, but whatever. And there's a whole poem on it on page 134. I'm not going to read it because we're getting on in this episode, but he does kind of, it does seem very critical of King, right? So he does seem very aware of the world around him and him being like, oh yeah, I use this opportunity to directly address the leader of our nation to say like, why aren't you doing better stuff? And like he seemed kind of like a dolt, right? Because all he wanted to do was talk about his film project.
Mhm.
It's like, why is this guy running our country? And so he did use his platform for very critical ways, and I do think that's kind of
Neat.
interesting. Right. Like good for him. You're doing the thing.
Again, it's just
Um
it's all tainted. Like I'm there and I'm like, this is all fine, but it's all still tainted by like your delusion.
yeah. 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 But if I didn't do it, nobody else would. Who was going to save the beavers?
Ugh.
Like
They would have been saved. That's how conservation works. Somebody stands up and fills the hole.
yeah. It is kind of fascinating because a lot of the stuff like yes, Parks Canada, is important and I'm not
Yeah.
saying that we should dismantle it at all. But it's like when you think back on it, it's like all of these things that they were asking for, it's like ultimately we listened to very little of it, right? So you're going through
Mm,
this whole thing of pretending like you're someone you're not to promote a message.
mm-hmm,
And that's not to say that that message is not important, but like ultimately the world we live in is still fucked. Like
mm-hmm,
it kind of didn't accomplish what he hoped it would accomplish. And a lot of the stuff just kind of went ahead anyway, which
mm-hmm,
is kind of says a lot about the march of history in many ways, right? And how you need more
mm,
than just one guy in red face to actually promote any kind of change in any meaningful way.
mm.
Um, yeah. Anyway, that's not to say that you shouldn't have your opinions and that you shouldn't like fight for what you think is right, but it is very emblematic also of
Mm-hmm.
how much you can actually achieve within a
Yes,
society
for
that's
sure.
not necessarily ready to embrace those changes that you're asking for. Right?
For sure.
Yeah. Anyway, do you have before we talk about like his death, do you have anything that you wanted to add? I think it's pretty we've covered a lot of it so far.
I don't know. I think I'm good before we
All
get
right.
into I I don't know. It's I because I enjoy the conservation aspect of it, and I love that he
Mhm.
found this. It's such a weird like I really want somebody to do a psychological profile on him to sort of diagnose like what was going on in his head for this, you
That would be
know?
so good. Yeah.
'Cause I just that's what I really want to see
Yeah.
to understand for this man is like
Yeah.
what was the psychology happening in his brain? What was going on there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
I mean,
overall
you can read.
he seems like he's just nice, like he's okay.
Yeah.
As
He
far
that's
as
I think
some dudes go, like take away that one thing and he seems like he's a good guy.
yeah.
So it's just
Yeah.
what was it going on in his head to make him believe
I
this?
I think that's why Ruffo's poetry, like we were alluding to at the beginning, like is more sympathetic than perhaps a lot of biographers were. It's just because like
Hmm.
he's not he doesn't seem like a bad guy. I don't condone what he's doing, right, at the basis, but not like a terrible bloke. Right. Like,
Hmm.
um, so take it with a grain of salt.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, literally nobody knew that he was English until his death. Right. That's really when it all came crumbling down. Um, where his English origins were kind of discovered almost immediately, might I add, because people were basically you needed like official documentation. and anything like that for like death certificates and so on. And very quickly they realize like, oh, it seems like this guy was never born on any
Mhm.
type of indigenous reservation. And well, look, his first wife is coming forward, and you know, it seems like she didn't know him quite as well as he claimed, or at least he didn't know him in the exact same ways that he claimed to be portraying himself. So it's like, oh, suddenly the story is very much falling apart. And there's a great part at the very end of Ruffo's poems where he compiles a series of obituaries, right? And a series of journal and newspaper headlines
Mhm.
that were talking about Bellany on the day or like the week that he died, right, in 1938. So the Ottawa Citizen, for example, right? And this is a poem that's created from it.
Mhm.
The chances are that Archie Bellany could not have done nearly such effective work for conservation of wildlife under his own name. It is an odd commentary, but true enough. The London Times. Since the death of Grey Owl, a remarkable conflict of opinion has arisen over his parentage, particularly regarding his Indian blood. The Liverpool Daily Post. What, after all, does this ancestry matter? The essential
Mm.
facts about his life are not in dispute, for as a conservation officer under the Canadian government and as a lecturer and broadcaster in Britain, he worked unceasingly for the protection of wildlife. The Manchester Guardian. Whatever his origins, he devoted his life to the understanding of nature, and the considerable fortune his writing and lecturing brought him to the relief of the suffering animals. And the Winnipeg Tribune, finally, his attainments as a writer and naturalist will survive, and when in later years our children's children are told of the strange masquerade, if it was a masquerade, their wonder and their appreciation will grow. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I do like the
Mm.
first one from the Ottawa Citizen. Like that
Yeah.
it would not that he wouldn't have been as effective if he just took on the name of Archibald Bellany. And I think
Mhm.
there is a grain of truth to that. Um I don't I think people were ready to believe in that particular moment that indigenous people knew more about nature.
Right.
Uh and that's not to forgive it, but I think like that was a mentality that people were more ready to swallow at the time. Don't know
Mhm.
if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, no, I think it does.
Yeah. Um, but I mean, the last one is wrong. Nobody remembers him now, so jokes on him, I guess. The children's children are not talking about the great work
God,
that Archibald Bellany has done for the
he's
beaver.
forgotten.
Well, they actually he did see a dip immediately after his death, mostly because of like the masquerading thing. Right, people just kind of
Mhm.
soured on him quite quickly. Um, but what is kind of interesting is that there was a resurgence in the 70s. And of course, as there was a huge resurgence of general interest in like white man's burden indigenous narratives in the 90s, so too
Yeah.
did that come back. So Gray Owl came back with like the rise of Dances with Wolves and Dancing with Wolves and Pocahontas and all of that. And a movie was made of him.
Mhm.
I'll give you three guesses as to who was a major actor in the 90s that would have played Gray Owl, a movie directed by Richard Attenborough, by the way.
Oh God. I don't know, Mel Gibson,
It was that's a good choice, but no, it was not Mel Gibson.
who
He
played
played
him?
James Bond, perhaps. We're bringing it full circle with James Bond.
Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan.
Pierce Brosnan.
There we go. God
Pierce
damn it.
Brosnan plays Gray Owl. Heyo.
Ayo.
Oh god. So anyway, no one remembers that movie either, even though it came out like 30 years ago, not even. Oh god. Oh, sorry, 1999. I was wrong. Um,
Oh, sorry, sorry,
but yeah,
sorry.
yeah. Apologies. It's not a particularly good movie, by the way. If people are interested in watching Pierce Brosnan act like an indigenous person, Act like a British person acting like an indigenous person. Not great.
It's not good, dude. Not cool.
I mean, if it's historically
Well,
accurate, it is a white dude playing an Indian in this case.
yeah, sure, I guess.
Like literally the only time when it would be acceptable to see it on film is because it
Hmm.
is literally what happened in history, I guess. Okay. I don't know. Like I had a whole section about talking about the Ruffo's poetry, right? But I feel like we kind of talked about it throughout anyway, and
Mhm.
then we commented on it. Um, I don't know. Do you have anything that you want to add or say either about the poems or this
I
whole
find the
discussion?
poetry is an interesting way to bring back and rediscuss this tale. I find
Yeah.
this collection of poetry and this sort of long running poetic format does sort of speak to a larger conversation in Canada just around things like form.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think he uses his medium quite well.
Yeah. Yeah. He does that. Like I know you didn't read all of the book, but it kind of goes
Mm.
back and forth in time, and it's not just from Bellany's voice. It is from multiple
Hmm.
voices throughout. His wives, his it goes into the future, past his death, it goes into the past, and it does give a verbal sense of the kind of bicultural composite that it was his life, right?
Hmm.
Through the actual text itself. So I think you're absolutely right in saying that. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, and of course the use of language to construct oneself is like integral to how Grey Owl constructed himself. He's just constructing a story, right?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, definitely, definitely, I think a good one. And yeah, there's been a lot of like articles about Ruffo's poems. With the form, they like to talk about like the what you said at the beginning, the long form or the long poem,
Hmm.
right? Which is very Canadian, right? Or not very Canadian, but it's something that a lot of
We
Canadian
have
authors have
done
like grabbed onto. Yeah, exactly.
something we like to do.
Yeah, and so it is interesting that he's using this form that such well-established Canadian authors as Eli Mandel and Margaret Atwood and Michael Ondaatje have used to also deconstruct the genre. Um, so there's probably something to be said here about an indigenous voice deconstructing a form that a lot of Euro Canadians are using, right, or have used in the past. There's probably something there. I don't know what, but
Mm.
there's something there. um, yeah, I don't know. Ultimately, I guess he's okay, right?
Hmm.
That's as good as we're gonna say about him.
Yeah,
He's
it's like I don't
whatever.
know. I know some people are gonna be like, oh, he did something. I'm like, at the end of the day, he probably like I I don't want to claim to put some kind of mental illness or delusion on him, but
Yeah,
something was going on in his head. And
yeah,
again, this could have like a major trauma reaction to World War One,
hmm
very much
yeah,
possibility.
yeah.
So
I think,
it's
but
just it's
I think it
hard.
comes back. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just one of those things like the legacy of what he has done is tainted because of it.
Hmm.
But I also can't blame him. I can only blame the system that didn't like treat him.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I think you're right. Like that reaction is you see it all over. We were talking about the group of seven a couple of episodes ago, and
Hmm.
that desire to look back towards nature in pristine or imagined, imagined conserved way, right, as a landscape, I
Yeah.
think is very much something that was growing at the time in a lot of Canadian spheres, right, as industrialization and modernity was fully taking over, right? Both
Hmm.
during and after the First World. And so in many ways, he was very much a part of a zeitgeist. He just
Hmm.
decided to kind of grab onto it in a problematic way. Um, yeah, I think where he kind of faltered, if we wanted to add a modern view on it, or like add our present glasses onto it, is that he took the angle of conservation, right? Seeing nature as this very still image, much like the group of seven did, right? Nature as a landscape, right? Something that you can shape into something beautiful and pristine and fixed. Which it never is. It's never just that. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of where a lot of his eco-criticism kind of falters. But that's just a present day view of I don't think any way that he would have known this at the time. Right. Like, but anyway.
Anyway, we didn't
Back.
get to talk about his eco stuff as much as we probably should have, but I'm sure we'll get to it later.
I mean, we've talked about it on the show before.
That's true. And Pop Canada.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So, eco stuff. Protect the environment.
Eco stuff. Save the world. With
Save the
Captain
world. Save the
Planet.
beaver. That's what Captain Planet was missing to be fully effective, was a beaver.
A beaver. Oh God.
As a sidekick. Just a beaver sidekick.
Take us away, Patrick, before it gets any worse.
No, you take us away.
All right, folks. This has been a Cultural History of Canada, our new official name and title. Thanks for listening. If you ever have any questions, comments, or concerns, please reach out on Facebook or by email. Support the show through PayPal if you want. You can use our affiliate links. You can also find perks like extra and ad-free episodes on Patreon. But as always, this is all optional, and the show will continue to remain free and independent. But if you want to leave a review on iTunes and share with some friends, it would be very appreciated. This will help boost the show and get it to more people's ears. We will see you all next time on A Cultural History of Canadiana. Cheers.
You butchered the name at the end, but whatever.
Who cares?
92% of households that join Peloton early in the year are still active a year later.
Yeah, if you like cycling to EDM.
Not just EDM. Try cycling to Broadway hits, take a scenic hike in Iceland on our treadmill, or roll to some 80s jams.
Because I have so much free time.
Whether you have 30 minutes or just 5, Peloton can fit any schedule. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton tread, row, or bikes risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.